Welcome to The Shift. I'm Dean.
And I'm Akasha. We cover the latest in all things science, technology, and culture, with new episodes dropping every Monday.
From the latest advances in knowledge systems and information theory to exploring emerging mediums of art and medicine. Join us as we do bite-sized deep dives on the latest.
The shift is now. Ready for a real head-scratcher today? We're diving into consciousness, like what it actually is.
Yeah, it's a big one, right?
Yeah.
But we're not getting lost in the philosophy maze this time.
Nope, we're going research-based, cutting-edge stuff with active inference. Heard of it?
Oh, yeah. It's not just asking what is consciousness anymore. It's like, how does it actually work? Which is way more interesting.
Totally. Action over abstract ideas. That's us. We're using this paper, A Beautiful Loop, an active inference theory of consciousness. Kind of poetic for a research paper, don't you think?
Catchy, for sure. And it gets to some really cool ideas about how our brains build our realities, like literally construct what we experience.
Okay, I'm hooked already. So how do we even start unpacking something as huge as consciousness?
Well, they start with this basic idea. Your brain's always working behind the scenes, building a simulation, like an inner VR of the world around you.
So like our brain's best guess at what's going on, constantly updating.
Exactly. It's called the Generative Phenomenal Unified World Model. But we can just think of it as our brain-built reality, always changing with new info. And this model, it's not just some abstract thing. It's crucial for us to, actually do anything in the world.
Really? So without it, we couldn't function at all?
Even simple things, like picking up a coffee or having this conversation, it all relies on this model.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, think about catching a ball. Your brain's predicting the trajectory, the speed, everything, and coordinating your movements, all based on that model.
So we're basically walking, talking predictions. Huh. That makes this whole model thing much more concrete. But how does it make us conscious?
That's the million-dollar question. And to answer it, active inference gets us thinking. Why are some things so clear to us, while others we don't even notice?
True. It's like our senses are bombarded with info, but only a fraction reaches our awareness.
Exactly. This paper talks about binocular rivalry. Imagine seeing, a house with one eye and a face with the other. Your brain can't process both at once, so your perception flips between them.
So our brain has to pick a reality, basically.
Yeah. And that choice, that's key. It's called inferential competition, and is a big part of understanding consciousness through this active inference lens.
So our brains are constantly battling for our attention. How does something win that battle? What makes it important enough to reach our awareness?
Well, it's not random. There's a system. It's called Bayesian binding, and it's basically a two-pronged voting system in your brain.
A voting system. Okay, now I have to know how this works. What are the criteria?
First, coherence the info has to fit with your existing model of the world.
So if I'm walking in a park, my brain's more focused on trees and squirrels than, say, a giant floating hamburger.
Exactly. Your brain would flag that hamburger as whoa, anomaly. Unless there's overwhelming proof, it's probably a hallucination.
Because a well-dressed hamburger breaks my park reality model.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second criteria of reducing uncertainty. Our brains love information that helps predict the future. Evolutionarily, better predictions meant survival.
So it's not just about what makes sense now, but what helps me navigate later.
Right. Like with that binocular rivalry, your brain's using these criteria to find the most likely explanation for those images, reducing uncertainty, creating a coherent reality.
So Bayesian binding is like creating the most believable story for my brain.
It's more than just a story. It's the mechanism of how something becomes part of your conscious experience.
Yeah.
And not just basic senses, but that feeling of, I am experiencing this.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's something even weirder about consciousness, right? It's not just being aware, it's knowing that you're aware. How does that fit in?
You're right. There's that extra layer, that knowing you're aware. The paper calls it epistemic depth, and it gets at that knowing that you know.
Epistemic depth sounds kind of heavy. My brain needs a workout just to say it. But honestly, wrapping my head around the concept, that's a whole other challenge.
It's a tough one, for sure. Think of it like this. When you're talking, you don't just make noise, right? You hear yourself, too, and that changes what you say next.
Ah, so it's not just our brain making the model. That model then gets fed back into the system. It's a loop.
Exactly. That constant feedback is how the model knows it exists. And how precise that loop is, well, the paper says that affects how clear our awareness is. They use this term, reflexivity precision, basically the clarity dial of consciousness. More precise feedback, brighter, more vivid awareness.
I like that clarity dial. So the better that feedback loop is tuned, the richer our experience.
Exactly. And this is where it gets even cooler, because active inference, this whole idea with epistemic depth, it changes how we think about stuff we take for granted, like even attention.
Wait, we're talking rethinking how attention works, just from this.
What if attention isn't about focusing in, but more like simplifying the model, turning down the volume on everything else so you can clearly hear that one thing?
So less like a spotlight, more like noise canceling for our brains,
Yeah.
helping us focus.
Perfect analogy. And the reason we can even be aware of our attention is because it's part of that feedback loop, the model feeding back into itself, epistemic depth in action.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. But what about thinking itself? Where does that fit into all of this?
So the paper talks about metacognition, thinking about thinking.
Huh.
And they suggest that even something that complex can be understood through this epistemic depth idea.
You're blowing my mind here. Are you saying my deep thoughts are just another feedback loop in my brain's model?
It's not that they're not meaningful. It's more that this framework helps us connect the dots between all of these different aspects of consciousness, from basic senses to complex thought.
So less like separate parts of the brain and more like this one continuous process.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really wild is how well this explains altered states of consciousness, too.
Yeah.
Sleep, dreams,
Yeah.
even lucid dreaming, that sudden I'm in a dream realization.
Okay, yeah, that's always fascinated me. So active inference can shed light on those weirder states of consciousness. Tell me more.
Think about it. In deep sleep, your reality model, it gets really minimal. Less sensory input, that feedback loop weakens.
So our brain's basically like pause on the detailed simulation for a bit.
Basically, less activity, less epistemic depth, and bam, less conscious awareness. Explains why we're not conscious in the same way during deep sleep.
Makes sense. But then there's dreaming, right, where our brains are creating these whole worlds, even if they are kind of bizarre sometimes.
Exactly. And in dreams, those models, they get more active again, more complex than in deep sleep. But that feedback loop, that self-awareness, it's still dampened.
Which is why we rarely question what's happening in our dreams while we're dreaming. Huh, it all feels real.
Exactly. But then you have lucid dreaming, that sudden, wait, I'm dreaming moment.
And some people can even control their dreams when that happens, which just seems impossible.
It's pretty wild. And the way this framework sees it, lucid dreaming could be like a surge in epistemic depth, but within the dream, that feedback loop reactivates. You get that knowing that you know, but this time it's knowing you're in a dream state.
Man, this active inference model is way more powerful than I realized. It ties together so much.
It's remarkable, right? And it doesn't stop there. This also has huge implications for stuff like meditation, even psychedelic experiences.
Okay, now you're really making me think. So how does active inference connect to meditation? Especially the kind where people talk about experiencing pure awareness.
So this is where it gets super interesting. Remember, minimal phenomenal experience, or MPE, from the paper. That's basically describing that state of pure awareness, stripped of all the usual stuff, thoughts, sensations, even a sense of self.
Like a blank slate of consciousness?
Exactly. And they're saying MPE can be explained by having a really simple reality model, but with super high epistemic depth.
So the feedback loop's still going, but there's just not much being fed back. Just pure awareness without anything to be aware of.
Exactly. It's like the system's zeroed in on just being aware, not on any specific thing.
That's wild. And it kind of lines up with what a lot of meditators talk about, right? That pure, open awareness. And often they say it comes with this deep sense of peace, even bliss.
And the paper suggests that bliss might be because of the minimal model itself. Minimal content, minimal uncertainty, minimal mental suffering even. Like the brain's finally chilling because it's not trying to predict and control a crazy world all the time.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So meditation, in a way, it's like simplifying our reality model on purpose, letting go of all the extra stuff to get to that pure awareness.
You got it. They even talk about how this relates to de-redification in meditation, that realization that Our thoughts, our emotions, they're not actually solid things, just temporary experiences.
Which makes sense, right? If we see that our reality model is built by our brain, we can detach from it a little, not take it all so seriously.
And they say that detachment, that de-ratification, it gets easier with more epistemic depth. The more aware we are of how the model's made, the easier to see through the illusion.
This is changing how I think about meditation for sure. Okay, before we all achieve enlightenment here, you mentioned psychedelics earlier. How do those experiences fit in?
It's a huge area of research, and this paper has a really interesting take on it. They suggest that the whole expanded consciousness thing people describe on psychedelics, that could be from a temporary boost in epistemic depth too.
So, kind of like meditation, but with a different trigger. Like psychedelics crank up that feedback loop, make us hyper aware, even if it's just for a little while.
That's the idea. And there's some brain imaging studies showing psychedelics can increase functional connectivity in the brain, especially in areas linked to self-awareness.
So, it's like rewiring things temporarily to boost that awareness, that clarity dial we talked about.
Exactly. And that could explain why people often have these big insights, shifts in perspective after those experiences. It's like seeing yourself and the world through a whole new lens, more clear, more connected.
This whole conversation has been mind-blowing. So, if this active inference thing is the future of understanding consciousness, what's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, the paper ends on what might be the biggest implication of all artificial intelligence. And what's really cool is they don't get stuck on, can AI be conscious? They go deeper, asking, does AI have a unified reality model? Does it show inferential competition? And most importantly, does it have epistemic depth?
Whoa, those are some heavy questions. And the answers could totally change how we develop AI in the future.
Right. If we made AI that ticked those boxes, would we call it conscious? Would we owe it the same treatment as any other conscious being? We got to start figuring this out now, especially as AI gets more advanced.
This deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I've learned so much about consciousness, like how it actually happens in our brains.
It's such a rich field of study. And for me, the beauty of this active inference framework is it bridges that gap between what we experience and what science can study. It lets us actually research something as slippery as consciousness.
And it opens up so many new paths to explore. From those altered states we talked about to rethinking what it means for AI to be truly intelligent, maybe even conscious.
It's a truly exciting time to be studying the mind.
Absolutely. One thing's for sure, this journey into consciousness, it's just getting started, and we're barely scratching the surface. For our listeners, if you want to go deeper, we'll have links to the research and other cool stuff in the show notes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those big questions, and keep that feedback loop buzzing. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Join us on October 10th for the Shift event hosted by SF Tech Week.
If you like today's podcast, share your thoughts on X, Instagram, or Facebook. We'll be reposting our favorite comments. And that wraps up this episode. Thank you for tuning in. And remember, the shift is now. Agency, powered by 5D Studios.